On this edition of Independent Sources, Propping Up Police Reform, a community organization hits the streets in an effort to address inconsistencies in neighborhood policing. And Pride in the Game, a sport played by Chinese men, becomes a symbol of their masculinity but segregates other ethnicities and women. Those stories and more coming up on Independent Sources. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Gary Pierre. One community organization is pounding the pavement to highlight the inconsistencies in how the NYPD polices white neighborhoods compared to communities of color. The Police Reform Organization Project, or PROP, recently released a report that showed that between 86 and 91% of the department's misdemeanor arrests over the last 2 years were people of color. Abby Ishola sat down with PROP's director, Robert Ganji, to find out more about what they've been doing to address these disparities.
Welcome, Robert.
It's good to be here.
Thank you. Describe the work you do through your organization, PROP.
Well, PROP stands for the Police Reform Organizing Project, and we are an advocacy organizing organization. We're dedicated to exposing and correcting discriminatory and abusive police practices. When we first began, which was like the summer of 2011, our goal, along with the goal of a number of people and organizations in the police reform movement, was to see what we could do to affect the public debate during the mayoral campaign in 2013. And we succeeded at that. I mean, not just PROP. I mean, all the organizations working on it. There was a very well covered by the press lawsuit where a couple of organizations were suing the city about stop and frisk.
Yeah.
And de Blasio, who obviously eventually became mayor, took a very strong position against stop and frisk during his campaign. And we were at that point very encouraged when de Blasio won by a landslide, that he would enact significant changes to NYPD practice.
Okay. So what do you think is the main issue with the NYPD's broken windows policing?
Well, the main issue is that it is blatantly discriminatory, and we think ineffective, but certainly blatantly discriminatory and deeply immoral, because it every day targets and harasses low-income people of color who engage in low-level infractions. So I'm going to keep saying this word every day because it happens consistently. NYPD officers, driven by a quota system, will give tickets to or arrest low-income people of color who engage in activities that have been virtually decriminalized in white communities. So bike on the sidewalk, carrying an open alcohol container, even if you're not drinking, even if you're not being disruptive.
And you say it's for gentrifying neighborhoods, right?
It's certainly, some people think that this kind of policing is part of the aim of it is to clear away the housing that's occupied by low-income people of color and make those communities ripe for more well-to-do people to move in.
Wow.
And so one of the projects of the Police Reform Organizing Project is to do court monitoring. So we go into the arraignment parts of the criminal courts in New York City. And that's an important activity because anyone who gets arrested in New York City has to be arraigned. So if you go into the arraignment parts, particularly in the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan, and Queens, on a consistent basis, you will get a very unassailable picture of who the police are arresting.
Wow. And
the consistently 85 to 95% of the people that we observe are people of color. Sometimes everybody's a person of color. 100% of the people are people of color. And consistently, the charges are very low level. Fare beating sometimes is the most, it's called theft of service, is the most significant charge. But it can be bike on the sidewalk. It can be something called aggressive begging. Walking between two subway cars, even if the train is stopped.
Wow.
Having your foot up on the subway seat at 2:30 in the morning. We've been there when people have been arrested, and the court officer will announce people arrested for the unauthorized selling of bottled water on the subway.
Wow.
and it's always, invariably, low-income Latino or African-American people.
Wow. So recently you and members of your organization went to Park Slope to
Right.
give out mock tickets.
Right. Yeah, we called
some
it
of
a
the white
mock,
residents.
a mock Summons Day, where we gave out mock tickets to white people living in Park Slope. And the point wasn't to annoy the white people, although on a few occasions we did. The point was to put into sharp relief the fact that ordinarily white people are not being given tickets for riding a bike on the sidewalk or for jaywalking. But if they lived in a different neighborhood and were people of color, they might very well get sanctioned. They might even on occasion get locked up for things like jaywalking or riding a bike on the sidewalk.
Wow.
And the action was a success. It got a lot of attention, particularly on social media.
Wow.
And I encountered a number of young people over the next week or two in the course of my work, many of whom read about it on Facebook.
Wow. So how did the residents in Park Slope respond when you gave them a
It was
mock?
a mix. Some people were very open about it and interested. So we also have a petition that we ask people to sign that calls on Mayor de Blasio to abandon broken windows policing, to abolish the quota system. And a number of the people in Park Slope signed the petition. And some people did get very angry. I stopped one woman who was riding a bike on the sidewalk, and she clearly was ruffled and angry.
Wow.
And I did manage to say to her, do you know if you were riding your bike in a different neighborhood and were a person of color, you might very well get a ticket? And she said to me, I'm aware that you are not a cop, now get out of my way.
Oh my God.
At which point I stepped aside.
Wow. So what's next? You have this petition. How
Right.
far are you along with?
One of our challenges is to come up with strategies, effective strategies at exposing these problems, exposing how blatantly racist these practices are. And so what's next is almost like the $64,000 question, or given inflation, maybe now it's $128,000 question. We're already beginning to look ahead to the 2017 mayoral campaign and how most effectively to inject these issues into that public debate. And the main axe we're grinding and the main point we're making is that quota-driven broken windows policing, whether or not you think it's effective, whatever that means, we don't think it is. It is deeply immoral and blatantly racist, undeniably so. All you have to do is take a look at who the cops are arresting or ticketing every day. And those practices should be rejected by our society and our government on that basis alone. And we're, in a way, taking a leaf out of the chapter of the Civil Rights Movement. When the Civil Rights Movement began in the 1950s, very few people, I was alive and a sentient being at that time, and very few people gave the Civil Rights Movement any chance of bringing down the old Jim Crow, you know, the deeply entrenched system of segregation in the South. And it succeeded, and it succeeded not because it convinced people that it was effective or ineffective or cost too much money or whatever. It succeeded because the Civil Rights Movement convinced a sufficient number of Americans that it was a morally abhorrent and unjustifiable practice, and therefore had to be dismantled. And we, in effect, have that a similar ambition applied to abusive and discriminatory policing practices, and actually the practices of our entire criminal justice system after policing the way the courts operate, the way our jails and prisons operate. So it's a very ambitious goal, but we think given the shifting political climate, an achievable goal.
Okay, Robert, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you again for having me.
Still to come on the show, a game born from the segregation of Asian men endures and becomes a symbol of pride. Before that, Crystal Lowe has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. Don't move, improve. That's the mantra of high school students in the Urban Assembly Bronx Academy of Letters who are looking at the issue of segregation in city schools. Students in an elective class on school integration are tackling the issue through advocacy and filmmaking. The program's goal is to help students of different races and backgrounds see potential in schools like Bronx Letters, where an overwhelming majority of the students are Hispanic and Black and live below the poverty line. Chalkbeat reports that the program comes at a time when the city's schools are identified as some of the most segregated in the nation. From the lowdown, a coalition of neighborhood organizations are lobbying to designate the Lower East Side as a historic district. The effort is being led by the Friends of the Lower East Side and the Lower East Side Preservation Initiative. The coalition hopes to preserve the unique architectural character and history of the community. Organizers are asking the city to create the district in the area below Delancey Street. Exact boundaries are still under discussion. Members of the community are split over the proposal. While some want to preserve the streetscape known to so many immigrants and migrants as their first home, others fear that regulations might have unintended consequences on small property owners. Chelsea residents are relieved to find that a former women's prison will be turned into a home for several nonprofit women's organizations. The Women's Building, as it's being called, will be the first of its kind in New York State. The Bayview Correctional Facility was abandoned following its evacuation shortly before Superstorm Sandy hit New York in October 2012. Members of the community feared the building would be sold by the state with unwelcoming consequences. Fortunately, earlier this month, Governor Andrew Cuomo announced that the space would be converted into a building specifically designated to support the needs of women in the community. The Women's Building is set to be completed in the next 4 to 5 years. That from Chelsea Now. And finally, Voices of New York reports on contemporary jazz and its fusion with Pakistani classical music. Academy Award-winning director Sharmeen Obaid-Chinoy and Brooklyn-based director Andy Shakin have produced a feature-length film called Song of Lahore. The film documents the attempts of Lahore-trained musicians to keep classical Pakistani music alive in the face of growing disinterest among national audiences and the threat of creeping religious extremism. The film follows a group of musicians that made several recordings and studio albums that failed to garner national attention. Now, with their rendition of jazz classic Take 5, they've taken the internet by storm. The film is in theaters now. Those are just a few headlines from the city's ethnic and community media. Independent sources will be right back.
Thanks for staying tuned. This week's In Focus segment zooms in on the film called Nine Men. Nine Men is a frenetic and often fiery sport that is very similar to volleyball, except that there are 9 players a side rather than 6. Zyphus LeBrun spoke with the film's director, Ursula Liang, about the origins of the sport that is steeped in a history of segregation and how it's become a symbol of Chinese masculinity.
Ursula, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, before we start our conversation, let's take a look at the trailer for your film, Nine Men.
We used to call other volleyball sissy ball. This was something that was uniquely ours. It was a game that was played by Chinese men.
Working in a laundry or a restaurant was seen as kind of female labor that Chinese men were qualified to do.
It was a bachelor society with no girls, nothing. I mean, that took all the stress and everything away, the loneliness.
The whole premise behind Nine Men in the U.S. is that it was their only outlet.
This is not our land, this is still America, you know. The stereotype is still there.
It's flattering that other cultures want to get involved, but there's a line. And you gotta keep that line.
Take it! Come on! I think I might be bleeding.
All of our summers for our entire lives have led up to this. Every time I play, I just have a chip on my shoulder to prove to him, to prove to the world.
We're all family, man. We're all Chinese people.
Look at the 9 men to death.
This
this is our World Series. This is our Super Bowl.
Nine-man. Looks really exciting. So it looks like it's what traditionally would be considered volleyball, but it's not. So could you explain how the game goes?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons that nobody has written or done a film about this sport before, because you walk by and you may dismiss it as volleyball, but to me it's a very different game. I grew up playing volleyball and I could not walk onto a nine-man court and play. There's some very obvious differences, one being that there are 9 people on each side, which makes the game very different if you're used to playing with 6 people. They don't rotate. You can also hit the ball more than once in a row, so you could throw the ball into the net and then play it again. And you know, among many other nuanced differences, but the overall difference is that the game is a lot faster, there are a lot more rallies, and it's a lot more innovative, sort of like the jazz version of volleyball. Okay. And they also play on the street, so this is important to the guys. They're playing oftentimes on concrete, so rough and tumble surfaces that add a lot of extra swagger to the game.
Okay, so there's a lot of history to this game. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about it?
Sure. The game actually started when people from China came to the U.S. to work, and they brought this game from their homeland. Its origins are in Toisan, China, which is a southern area of China where most of the immigrants came from in the early days. And people at that time were working really tough jobs. There were not very many opportunities available to Chinese men in the U.S. There was a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which kept Chinese men who came here to work from bringing their families over, from bringing women over. And so this was almost like all-male society, and these guys were working really tough conditions, many, many hours a day, physical labor, low-end jobs that people, you know, were taking emotional abuse while they were working. So many of the guys were working in laundries, they were working in restaurants, they were doing jobs that the average white American would consider sort of feminine jobs, service jobs. And they worked, you know, so many hours and so many days a week that they had very little personal time. And this game sort of was one of their ways to escape both the emotional pressure and the physical pressure of their daily grind. So they would, when they had time, they would go out into sort of the back alleys and parking lots of the Chinatowns that they worked in, and they would put a string between 2 trees, and they would take a towel, and they would wrap it with rope and turn it into a ball, and they would play this game.
Wow, wow. So, you know, it's fascinating because you talk about the origins being steeped in, you know, like that culture that has found itself being separate. One of the gentlemen in the clip talks about the fact that it's our sport, like other cultures want to get involved. It seems kind of provincial. Is that the sort of an attitude that nine-man is kind of like our sport for Asian men? Is that the sense you got when you...
Well, they definitely have a lot of pride in the fact that it is their sport. But one of the things we wanted to do with the documentary is show why that is. So Chinese American men were excluded in so many ways throughout their history in the U.S. and even till today. And we're talking about, you know, exclusion that was legislated. This is the first ethnic group that had ever had a specific law that was written to keep them out of this country. And they were basically ghettoized to Chinatowns. They weren't able to find lives and livelihoods in the mainstream world, and so they were sort of sent to these places and gathered in these places that became community for them. So out of being excluded from other things and being hated and treated really badly, they found their own community and found their own strength. And this sort of community and strength has persisted over the years. One of the reasons we made the film sort of take a modern-day narrative following players in modern times and not just making a historical documentary is because some of these things still affect Asian American men. A lot of people see Asian American men as sort of the model minority, fully integrated. They have all the advantages in this world, but there's still something within the community that makes them feel like they want to have their own space and their own sport, and to be around people like themselves, to celebrate their culture together.
Right, right. It was really remarkable, the sort of Jeremy Lin when he was here in New York and Yao Ming and so forth, how the kind of people rallied around, you know, them as symbols for Asian Americans in sports, yeah?
Yeah,
so
I
it's
mean,
a similar thing here?
Absolutely. And one great thing about following the Nine-Man guys and seeing sort of the historical development of the game is that you realize that there are actually a lot of Asian American sports heroes. I mean, a lot of people see Yao Ming and particularly Jeremy Lin, because he's actually American, as sort of the only icons in sports for our community. But if you actually go back into the streets and into the communities, you'll see, you know, kids that grew up in Chinatown who played nine-man, who were 6 years old, and who just watched those other guys play on the streets and wanted to be them. Their own little Michael Jordans, their own little Jeremy Lins. existed in those communities if they were part of the Nine Man community.
So from the film, it seems that this has grown from something that's kind of like a grassroots sports to now something that is more organized, and there are teams with uniforms and everything. Tell me about that.
Yeah. I mean, there's something about the spirit of Nine Man that's always a little bit chaotic and disorganized, and that's something that I love, and I think it's also a little bit part of Chinese American culture in general. But yeah, it started out in this very like ragtag way, and now there's a tournament that attracts over 50 teams. We're talking about thousands of people. Every year there's a tournament during Labor Day, and it's organized. It takes a lot of money from the community in order to be able to rent spaces and put up nets and make it happen. And there are teams that practice all summer long. The film actually follows several teams that are practicing from May until September, and they're all fighting for this one championship, which is still a bragging rights tournament.
Right.
It's like they're not winning anything. They're not even winning, well, I guess they do win a trophy, but there's no money at the end of this.
Involved. Right.
There's a lot of money and support that goes into making the tournaments happen and helping these kids practice all year long. But ultimately, it's just like, it's pride.
It's pride
at the end of it.
And where's the tournament held? Is it here in New York?
Well, the tournament happens every summer in New York. A mini tournament happens in New York at Seward Park. And the national tournament happens every Labor Day weekend, and then actually travels between major Chinatowns. So there are 7 cities that currently host the tournament, and this year the tournament is going to be hosted by Los Angeles.
Oh.
So
we're going to miss out.
Well, you missed it. It was this fall. It was actually in New York City, and it got so big that they could no longer really hold it in Chinatown, and they played in the parking lot of Basketball City. So it was really fun. It was a little bit farther outside of Chinatown than they usually like, because part of the tournament is the goal of the tournament is to actually bring business back into Chinatown and to have entertainment for the folks that live there. Like, one of the great things that I love to see when I go to the tournament is all these old men, like sometimes with their shoes off, and sometimes betting on games on the side and hanging on the fences. Like, they have such a great time watching the community and watching the sport, and they know the players, they know the histories, and they just get into it like it's like it's the New York Giants or something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the film. I know you've screened it here in the city already. Where can folks see it?
Well, the film is available online now. We're doing on demand, so you can go to our website, 9-man.com, and see it anytime. And we're also still screening around the country. We're hoping to be at a lot of universities in the near future. We're still doing a few festivals, although most of our festival run already happened. And we're just trying to get to as many spaces as possible, because, for me, this is not just a sports film. Like, I think some of my goal was to make a film that was entertaining, that people would want to watch, not like just a boring historical talking heads film. But although it's got a sports narrative, I think that there's a lot to learn about the Chinese American community by watching the film. And I think there's a lot of depth and nuance to the characters within the film. And so I'm hoping that it will get to bigger and bigger audiences.
All right. So what's the response been so far?
It's been good. I mean, people walk up to me and they usually say nice things. They're not going to say like the meanest things to the director, but the players, I think, are really proud that the film has given them given their sport and the thing that they love a little bit more opportunity to be seen and be appreciated by people outside of the community. Sometimes they're mad if their team is not shown making like the winning point, and in sports, like, there's only one team that ultimately wins. So there's really only one team that's going to be completely happy with the film. There's one of our main characters who's has a really lovely presence on screen. Like, he has such a hard time watching it because he just watches it and thinks about I should have done this differently. I should have done that right. He's like, and I know I'm going to lose at the end. So he has it's really hard for him emotionally to sit through it.
It's like looking at game film for
him.
Yeah,
exactly.
All right. Well, Ursula, thank you very much, and good luck with the film.
Thank you so much.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.